Welcome to Othman's Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Reda Othman. Today, we are exploring how market intelligence gives leaders the foundation to plan and execute high impact initiatives. And we have a very special guest with us to guide the conversation. Please join me in welcoming Aaron Cruikshank, President of CTRS Market Intelligence in Vancouver. Aaron and his team have completed more than 1,000 projects for different organizations over 25 years. And he also teaches market intelligence at the graduate level. Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
My absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Aaron, tell us about your work and what market intelligence mean in simple everyday language.
Sure. So our clients often call us when they've got a major decision or go-to-market plan that they're trying to pull together, and they feel like they don't have enough information to make an informed decision. So oftentimes organizations will use business intelligence, so looking at what's inside the organization. They'll use market research. They'll go out and ask customers, hey, what do you think about what we're doing? And the market intelligence is that third part. And what market intelligence is looking at everything that's happening external to an organization. What's happening in the economy? What's happening in the economy, what's happening in people's lives, what's happening with politics, what's happening with the environment. All of those things impact plans that you're trying to make, and you have to look at them because they have such a big impact on what's happening in your organization. So that's what we look at. We look at all those external factors and help organizations bring them inside to consider.
That's excellent. Why do most high-impact initiatives fail before execution starts? So, and every organization in every sector has their own initiatives to, whether it's to decrease expenses, create processes and systems, which I know you are a big fan of, improve revenue, improve overall culture. So, from your perspective, why do you think this is happening?
I think one of the big reasons why these failures happen is there's not a clear connection between the outcomes and the plan. So oftentimes, leadership will bring together a team and they'll say, hey, everybody, let's get together and make a plan for this outcome that we want to have happen. But oftentimes there's not a clear line of authority, or we're not enabling people to carry through those processes to make sure that the thing that they want to have happen happens. So you'll get a leadership committee together to say, we're going to sit down and we're going to study this thing that needs to happen. We're going to make plans. And then they go, great, this is the thing that we need to do. Job done. And they walk away from the table. And the problem is, a lot of times, no one's been given that explicit role to carry through the plan. And that needs to be somebody's job. That needs to be a named job that somebody does, is to execute on the plan. And now that sounds crazy that I say that there wouldn't be that, but oftentimes there's not. It's sort of, we collectively need to do this thing to move the plan ahead. And the problem is, when everybody owns the plan, technically nobody owns the plan in many ways, right? So you need a named person that is the whip for the plan that's going to carry it through. So that's one problem that I see. The other problem that I see sometimes is that the plan, what needs to happen in the plan, can run up against friction inside the organization because there's some structural belief or some entrenched process that people don't want to change or can't see beyond. And they say, oh, this isn't going to work. So you get that sort of passive internal resistance where people go, well, this isn't going to work, so I'm just going to do a sloppy job of my part of this, because what a waste of time, And so I think that happens more than people would realize as well. It's almost like internal sabotage when people don't believe that the plan is going to work. They'll throw wrenches in it, intentionally or unintentionally, just to,
That's excellent insight, because one of my clients that I'm helping, actually, he used a platform so he can assign who will do what. And one of the tasks, he will say, all is responsible for this task. And it turned out during our weekly check-in that the one that say all has not done yet. And I saw, and goes back to what you were sharing. If everyone own it, no one owns it.
Well, then who do you point the finger at and say, hey, you didn't do that thing that you said you were going to do? And it's like, we collectively dropped the ball, right? And then,
And this is where you have to assign just everyone, like a specific one to be responsible for this task.
When I put strategic plans together for my clients to help them execute on these things, I always layer on a RACI matrix. So responsible, accounted, consulted, and informed. So it looks like a Gantt chart, and it'll say like, okay, break down the major tasks into subtasks to say, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. But that RACI, the R, is the important letter. Who's responsible for getting that ball across the line? And I think neglecting to have that in your strategies is another reason why these things don't fly, because who's responsible? Got to write it down.
Yep. Exactly. So what is the difference between planning with internal data and planning with market intelligence?
That's a great question. I think a lot of organizations start with internal data, which is important. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. Everybody should do that. The problem with internal data is it's looking backwards. It tells you what's already happened and what's happened in the past, or what's currently happening and what's happened in the past. It does not really do a good job of forecasting where things are going to go, right? And when we're making plans, we're making plans for things that are going to happen in the future. So ideally, we would have some idea of what's going to happen in the future, right? So let's say, for example, you've got a group you're trying to service, and they're getting older, right? They're approaching retirement age. How is their relationship to your organization going to change once they're no longer working? Are they going to spend as much money on certain things? Are they going to require the same services that they required before they hit retirement age? You know, so I would be looking at things like that and saying, if our core customers are 65 or 55 to 65 years old today, that means 10 years from now, they're going to be senior citizens. So what does that mean for us as we're looking at that horizon? So these are the kind of things that you have to think about when you're trying to roll out plans that need to have a shelf life longer than a quarter.
Excellent. So what does it cost an organization when leader build a strategy on assumption instead of evidence, which would be the market intelligence?
Well, I mean, a lot of times people assign resources to these exercises, right? They'll say, okay, I'm going to put these 10 people on this job. I'm going to put a budget to this. I think oftentimes we forget that putting people on a job is also a cost, right? It's their salary, they're going to get paid no matter what, but it's an opportunity cost. What could that person be working on that would generate money for the organization or would save the organization money if they weren't working on this poorly considered plan? So even if it's just staff time, that's still a cost to the organization. And then there's money that you put into it as well. So I often liken what a lot of organizations do in this area is to throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? And that is a waste of resources. If there is no plan and there is no thought put behind the plan to say, this is what is true. So I guess every plan, sorry to back up a sec, I think every plan needs to be built on a foundation of truth, right? And if your foundation of truth is assumptions and things that you've convinced yourself or the organization has convinced themselves to be true without facts behind it, that foundation's pretty weak, right? And when we put facts into that foundation and forecasting and analysis and deep introspection, we can come up with a much more solid foundation from which to launch the plan. And then hopefully we won't waste those resources, because if you can forecast ahead based on facts and go, this is what I think is going to happen, this is what I anticipate is going to happen, I can model this, I can show people this is what's likely to happen. Ideally, you won't waste a bunch of money trying to execute something that won't work.
And I think that will determine resource allocation. to inform the strategy and actually help the organization to achieve the goals. So what stops leadership teams from facing what the research actually reveals?
Well, this is a really interesting question, because I'm increasingly seeing that there are institutional facts that aren't really facts. So somebody might say, I'll use an example. So I had a client I was working with who was selling rebar in Canada, and they're saying our market share of the rebar market in Canada is this big. What they'd completely neglected, because they weren't looking at facts, was there was an import market for rebar. They were only looking at domestic production. The import market represented about 30% of the rebar that's used in Canada, mostly out on the West Coast where I am. The steel for the rebar is mostly produced in Eastern Canada. So they were just looking at the Eastern Canadian market. And so they'd been telling their boss, hey, our market share is this much. And when I came in with facts, and we've got data from our federal government that shows exactly how much rebar gets imported, because it has to go through customs, that he didn't like that, because that shook a belief that the organization had about what their market share was. It made him look like a jerk if he goes to his boss and says, hey, all those market share numbers I've been telling you for the last few years, turns out those aren't accurate. So that's not going to necessarily reflect well on him. So it's very uncomfortable. So I think sometimes what happens in examples like that is when facts come in, they don't always support a belief that the organization has held for many years, right? The sky is blue, water is wet, things like this. And suddenly you're going, well, actually, water's not wet. It's the things that it touches that become wet. And you're like, no, I don't like that. I don't, so if the plan involves waterproofing the things that water touches instead of trying to make water dry, then suddenly people are going, oh, that's uncomfortable. I don't like that. And it can take a lot of, it can take a lot of strength as a leader to accept an uncomfortable truth as fact and say, this is true. And okay, let's acknowledge that this changes the way we see the world a little bit. And maybe that changes other things in the organization. We have to look at things a little bit differently because we've discovered this new truth that defines something about the organization. That can be very uncomfortable. It takes a lot of strength and confidence as a leader to wrap your hands around that and accept it and move forward.
And this is actually point me toward the importance of collaboration, Aaron, to make sure you have psychological safety, you have a culture that is conducive to high impact collaboration. Without that, the team would be struggling to surface that truth.
Well, and to build on that, if it's done collaboratively, then it's not someone's fault that this truth has emerged, right? If the team owns the truth and say, we collectively, I sound like a communist, we comrades have discovered that, this is the source of truth, right? If they come to it as a group and they come to an understanding as a group, then it's not someone's head on a pike, right? Now it's the group saying, we now have a better understanding of reality. This is what's going on. We collectively are going to move forward and try to solve this problem or change things.
Love it. So what sources and tools should they use to make sure the plan is grounded in reality?
There are so many things that you can look at, and I'm going to give you some examples, and I don't want anyone listening to this to think that you have to do all of these things. I think some of these things are good, but there are lots of places to look. One of the things I always look at first is, what are people already doing that are competitors, maybe organizations like mine. Sometimes our clients are asking us to do best practice research in other jurisdictions. So let's say somebody is a electricity utility in Western Canada. In this market, it's the government owns the electricity utility. So there's only one electricity utility you can go to. So there's nothing really wrong with us going to another jurisdiction and saying, what is that electrical utility over here doing in this space? How have they solved this problem? Or years ago, I had a contract I was doing for the automotive association. So every state, every province in Canada has an automotive association. So they sell roadside assistance plans. Sometimes they sell travel insurance, homeowners insurance. But every single one of those businesses has a side hustle that they also make money off. And so sometimes those side hustles fall apart and they need to switch. So the first thing the automotive associations do is go to the 60 plus other auto associations and say, hey, what's working for you guys? You guys were selling travel packages. Is that working? You guys are selling auto inspection services. Some of them are doing things like selling used cars. And so, so you can go around and look at organizations that look like yours and try to see what they're doing to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. I think that's a really great place to start because you can see what they did. And if they've been doing it long enough, you can see what the outcome was. Did it work for them? Did that thing work? And so I love going to other organizations to see what they've done. I also think you got to look at in my world, we talk about PESTEL analysis. So that stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. So I also think it's worth doing a scan to see what has happened recently, what has changed, what is going to change, especially around things like laws and policy that might affect what I'm trying to do, right? And so I think that's good to look at. I also think it's a good idea not just to look at organizations like yours, but to look at organizations that have some features in common, but might be in parallel or completely different industries to see, is there a learning from another sector that could be brought over to my organization to help? Another thing that I think a lot of folks don't do, and we've been doing this recently for a number of our customers, is this voice of the customer approach where you go and talk to the people who actually buy the stuff that you make or are serviced by the services that you provide, if it's a social good type thing. And a lot of times, if you listen to your frontline staff only, you also want to listen to your frontline staff, but you can't take their word for it 100% because they have a vested interest in presenting the facts in a certain way that makes them look good, right? So if I've had a number of situations where we've said, what's going on with the customers? And you go ask the salespeople and they'll paint a very rosy picture of what the customers think about the service or the product. And then you say, well, great. Well, I'd like to talk to some of those reference customers, and they give you some names and you start calling them up as an independent third party. And they tell you some shocking things sometimes. They're like, I'm really unhappy. Who told you we were a reference customer? I'm upset, and you're like, ooh. I think, and again, that comes back to discomfort. Like, I think one of the things we have to get comfortable with as leaders whenever we're exploring what the future looks like or what the future could look like is discomfort. You're going to learn things when you go out and start poking around that are going to make you uncomfortable. And you just have to be able to take those things in and move ahead.
And just curious about how you conduct the interview or the survey when you speak with the customer. Do you typically 3 questions per customer for certain number of customers that you have to reach, or how it's done?
Well, we call them in-depth interviews. So an in-depth interview is typically half an hour to 45 minutes long. In a 45-minute conversation, you can ask 5 to 7 questions. Typically, you want to let that person talk about their experiences. Silence is really powerful when you're doing these kind of conversations. I think sometimes when we call people up and we want to ask them things, if there's a pause, human nature is we want to fill that silence with words. But that's the same for the person that you're interviewing. So I always train my staff to, if there's a pause, don't be the first one to blink. Let it be an uncomfortable silence and let them speak up and tell you more stuff, right? So you want to keep the number of questions that you're asking to a minimum. You absolutely don't want to ask questions that you can look up or Google. So say, how many employees do you have? You can look that up. Don't waste time asking somebody that in a voice of the customer interview.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you.
One other thing I would add to that is I don't think there's anything wrong with incentivizing these conversations. So lots of times when we're doing these calls, we're offering somebody $150, $200 to have that conversation with us. That does a couple of things. One, it can open up people's calendars when they otherwise might be like, ugh, I don't have time for this. But I think, well, but $200, I can take my family out for a nice dinner for $200. Okay, maybe that's worth 45 minutes of my time. The other thing is, I think it really sends a good signal that you respect that person's time and you're acknowledging that person's time is worth something. Right? To say, look, I know I'm taking you away from something that you would normally be doing. And I just want to, as out of respect for your time, I want to offer you this money to compensate you for taking you away from whatever you're normally doing. So I think it's a good thing to offer an incentive.
I think it's very good practice and very fair too, to just exchange value for their time. So that's really excellent. So how does starting with intelligence change outcomes like revenue growth, cost reduction, or employee performance?
Well, whenever we're trying to do these things, ideally, you would model what you want the outcomes to be, right? So you say scenario plan, right? To say, okay, if this changes about the market, or if this becomes true about the market, then we can sell more of this, we could produce more of that, we could do less of this. We have an outcome that we want. We want more, we want less. I often try to frame these things as too little or too much problems, right? We have too little this, we have too much that. So the solution is we need to do X to increase or decrease that thing that it is, like a KPI or an output or something, right? Now, we can come up with a plan and say, I think to increase sales, we need to make more sales calls, right? That sounds pretty straightforward, but sometimes we actually have to model that and say, okay, what would it take to make more sales calls, right? Does that mean we need more sales staff? Does that mean we need better equipment? Does that mean we need better lead lists? Does that mean we need a CRM system, right? And so to just say we're going to triple sales, go do it, lots of times is not taking into account all of the things that one would need to do to arrive at that conclusion. So what the market intelligence does, and having those facts in hand does, is gives you data points to say, okay, this is what's happening. So let's just take sales as an example, right? Say I want to increase sales. Cool. We want to double sales in this market. Well, what if the external data shows you that you already have 40%, 50% market share in that sector or in that segment? That would tell me you're already probably getting all the customers that you're going to get in that space. So if somebody in the leadership team says, we're going to double that, and you say, we're going to double it to 100% market share, like that's insane. Nobody gets 100% market share, right? Yeah. So that might be something that's definitely something I would push back on, is say, okay, hold on. Like any business that's getting more than 30% market share is probably pretty saturated, so then that might lead to a different discussion where we can say, okay, so if we've already gone about as deep as we can with that segment, maybe we should be looking at another segment. Is there an adjacent segment of the market that we could be pushing into that could use this product or service that we could increase overall sales numbers? I just did that with an engineering firm in Ohio recently, where they want to increase sales, and they were looking at it and saying, what industries should we be pushing into that are adjacent to the industries that we're working in now to increase our sales numbers? And we were able to identify 3 markets that looked like good candidates. But there were potentially dozens of markets that they could have pushed into. So sometimes it's a winnowing down process to say, well, which are going to be the best? Which markets are going to produce the best outcomes for us? So all of it comes back to modeling and sort of saying, okay, here's the goal. Here's where I want to be. Here's where we are today. If we're going to fill that gap, we have to model what that gap looks like. We can't just say, we're going to fill that gap. It's too simplistic. You need intel and data to show what filling that gap might look like. And then you can reflect on it internally and go, ooh, can we do that? Can we add 6 more salespeople? Can we reach that many customers? Can we, if we get those customers, can we service it? So say, yeah, we're going to sell into the nuclear industry. Cool. Nuclear is super heavily regulated. Do your folks that you work with have the kind of certifications that they need to service nuclear clients? Oh, whoops. I didn't think of that. Right. So these are the kind of things we have to look at.
Is part of what you are sharing is creating a change story, Aaron, to say, here is what will happen after we reach our goal. Here is where we are. Here is what where we want to be, and when we reach our goal, here is how it will give you more bonuses, will make your life easier. You will take more time off, whatever it is, or improve patient's experience. Is this where part of what you do, create a change story of what the status will look like after you reach the goal?
I guess so, in so much as we are taking intel to show what other people have done, right? So we're not just kind of, what do we think is going to happen? We have to model everything with facts. And I guess that's something I got to keep coming back to, is really all this stuff has to be modeled on factual information. So in this other industry, they tried to do a similar move. They hired more salespeople. They got their customer retention rates up by doing this, this, and this. So we can bring that over to a medical device company and say, hey, if we do this over here that they did in the gaming hardware sector, we should probably see the similar uptake because of this gamification factor or this interactivity with the cell phone factor that made that device more attractive for people to use, made it seem like a better alternative to the other options that they had, right? But we have to go find those things in the real world and be able to point to it and go, this is what happened over here. That worked. This didn't work. You know, we can't just make stuff up.
Love it. That's actually a very important insight. Model the outcome based on, excuse me, factual data. So that's excellent. So what is one example of an organization that did this right, and what result did they see?
Well,
shared a couple.
Yeah, I mean, one of the organizations that we're very proud to have worked with was an energy company in Eastern Canada that runs nuclear reactors, and somebody had come to them and said, "Hey, we think you could make this $100 million upgrade to one of your reactors to be able to produce radioisotopes and that go into this new class of cancer drugs." And but the company that hired us said, we don't know anything about radioisotopes. We know how to run nuclear reactors. We don't know anything about radioisotopes. We don't know anything about the pharmaceutical industry. How do we know that this $100 million upgrade to a reactor is going to have a positive return on investment? And so they needed evidence and modeled from other companies doing this to say, okay, if we make this upgrade, if we start producing these materials, drug companies will want to buy it. And these are the specific molecules that they're going to want to buy. So what we did was we went out and we talked to pharmaceutical companies. We talked to companies that were producing the feedstock isotopes that go into the reactor to say, what are you doing with them today? All this kind of stuff. And over the course of 6-7 months, we were able to map out the entire ecosystem for radiopharmaceuticals and give them a definitive answer that if you produce this, this, and this radioisotopes, there's more than enough demand. And then they were able to go back and talk to the folks that would upgrade the reactor to say, so the reactor needs to be able to irradiate these elements at this frequency. Can it do that? And they were like, yes, absolutely. So they went ahead and they upgraded the reactor, and they are currently producing radioisotopes that are going into a new class of very exciting life-saving drugs. And everybody's feeling great about it. But they didn't want to make that decision to go ahead and spend $100 million without knowing how it was going to play out. And everything that we told them about how it was going to play out came true, because we were able to look at what other companies had done, what other organizations had done. They weren't, I guess the difference here is they weren't inventing a new category of business. It's not like they were the first company to ever produce radioisotopes. Other organizations like theirs had already been doing it. So it was a matter of us finding who had been doing it, how they'd been doing it, and learning from that and being able to bring those factual learnings back into their plans to go, if you do it this way, you'll be successful. You'll make money. You'll help people.
So if they are not inventing, you can compare it to other competitors and see best practices. What if the company is inventing something new? Would you use the pistol analysis? or something else?
Yeah. So oftentimes when we're coming up with something, now I want to preface this by saying I've been in technology commercialization space for 30 years now. I have yet to see a truly new idea. I think most people fall in love with their ideas and they're like, this is revolutionary. This is going to change the world. And nobody's ever thought of anything like this before. Most of the time, that's not true. Usually somebody's already tried an aspect of what you're doing, and your innovation is a refinement of something that's already happened. So, which is fine. I'm not saying don't do that, but don't fool yourself to thinking that nobody's ever tried or done anything from this, because then you're missing opportunities to learn from what other things are happening. What I will say is there are still, even in 2026, niche markets that people have not explored, right? So there's that Blue Ocean strategy book that I often recommend to folks to say, if you want to get out of this hugely competitive, cutthroat space, find a blue ocean niche that nobody's servicing, right? So that might be saying, okay, so I have this invention. It's not currently being used by anybody in the construction industry or the education sector. Say, can we take this solution that's working over here in, say, petrochemicals or software and bring it into the education market? Yeah, you probably could. So what you're modeling now is it's not the innovation that you're modeling, it's the market. How could that market respond to this new thing that I'm introducing to them? Is there facts that would indicate that this is going to be successful? Because I've seen it work over here. People have done it over here. People have bought this kind of solution. What is true about them? Is that same thing true about the people in my market that I'm trying to service over here? If those things are true in both markets, then I have some evidence that the thing that I want, the idea that I want to bring over from here into this market could be successful. Then we start to dig into some of the other things about that market. Like, do they have the ability to pay? Do they believe that they have the pain point in the same way that this other industry believes? And so again, gathering data, gathering evidence, all of which will point to an answer to say, yes, this will work, or no, this is not going to work and you shouldn't do it.
Excellent. Any last advice for leaders who are embarking on planning and executing high impact initiatives for their organization, Aaron? Something that you didn't share during our questions that we didn't cover yet.
I would say if you look to organizations in Europe and Asia who have been doing great strides, like I think it's fair to say, you look at some of the stuff that's coming out of South Korea, you look at some of the stuff that's coming out of Germany, you look at some of the stuff that's coming out of French companies, there's some really incredible innovation happening and some really incredible growth. What are they doing differently? They are looking at the long term. They're looking at 5 to 10 year horizons, not a couple of quarters ahead. And I think that is something that we have to do in North America when we're looking at making big changes and big swings. The uncomfortable truth about it is that it slows things down a little bit. And I think in our culture, our business culture in North America, we have this grow, iterate fast, fail cheap, all this kind of stuff. And what we miss sometimes is how much resources and cycles get wasted by throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. And I think that's a cultural thing here in North America, and it's not a good thing. So I think being able to take a beat, pause, reflect, yes, it might slow things down by a quarter, right? And I think that obsession of quarter to quarter growth is really toxic in our business culture and organizational culture here. So taking a pause to slow down, look at all the things that we've been talking about is well worth it. I always talk about it as an ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure. Everything I'm advocating is that ounce of prevention to make sure that your execution is successful. But you have to slow down a little bit, and that's uncomfortable for some people.
That's excellent. While you are sharing, going and getting best practices even from other countries, a leader came to mind, Dr. Carol Burke, the Allentown, the superintendent of Allentown in Pennsylvania. She is doing awesome work in the district, and she's always big on innovation. So Dr. Burks, if you are listening, shout out to you. Keep the awesome work. Aaron, thank you so much for your insights that you shared today. I think that's a big help for our listeners.